It's going to talk about the archaeobotany of this site.
Yes, so I'm Senna Thornton-Barnett, and I've taken on this question of what on earth are they doing with this incredible terrace system. It's massive, it's really impressive, and until fairly recently we really didn't know very much about what they were growing there. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background to begin with. So explaining how people interpreted the site in terms of cropping strategies and what we've found out in the last few years since we've started this particular project. As Carol said, there's been quite a legacy of field work at Angaruka, and so it was kind of exciting to get some new information especially about the crops. So I'm going to start with this interpretation. I'm going to go through, or the past interpretation. I'm going to talk about our methodology, our excavation strategy, and how that informed my archaeobotanical sampling strategy, macrobotanical sampling, and phytolith sampling, which I'm not doing, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today. And then our results and what the implications are of these results. So previously, the only crop identified from Angaruka was sorghum. And this sorghum originated from samples taken during John Sutton's time from the habitation terraces. But there's some problems with this because we don't know who identified the sorghum. We don't know where the samples came from specifically. So the habitation terraces, it could be anywhere. I mean, it could have just been in the soil outside of a door. It could have been from a hearth. We really just don't know. And so this kind of information has just not been available. So we needed to get samples that we could trust, and so that's where my project began. Another piece of this interpretation, this previous interpretation, is that the average rainfall today is roughly 400 millimeters, suggesting that the field system employed this water management distribution system that Tabitha was talking quite a bit about. And the modern occupants of Angaruka employ a similar, though smaller scale system, but they don't grow sorghum. And so it begs the question, why would they have grown it in the past? Why aren't they growing it now? There's got to be more going on. And one of the key things that you see in the modern agronomy at Angaruka is there's a great deal of intercropping. They're growing a lot of crops that would not have been available in the past, like tobacco and tomatoes, in addition to more traditional crops like legumes, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, but they most certainly were growing. Abandonment may have been a result of low rainfall leading to possible crop failures, especially if they were relying on just sorghum. Doesn't seem very likely given what we found recently. The thing is that in spite of the fact that sorghum was the only crop that was identified, really nobody really believed it. But we had no proof, so that's where this study comes in. So my project was focused, or is focused, on the identification of archaeological, ethnographic, and ecological evidence for plant use in general and crop selection in particular. And from the get-go, crop selection was really my focus, but the more I work on this, the more the non-crop taxa become interesting. So I started primarily with excavation and flotation, so that's a good place to start generally. And then went into the markets around, like in Angaruka, but also in the urban centers nearby, like Motuambu, and collected some seeds, especially legumes, lots and lots of legumes. And then conducted some ethnobotanical hikes, so going out with local people who have a pretty good understanding of the usable plant landscape around Angaruka. And then, of course, the cog that is missing but is ever present is the analysis phase, which is where I'm at right now. Yeah, and primarily the focus is charred seeds and phytoliths, which you could also kind of consider a cog, but it's not. I'm actually not doing the phytolith analysis, but we have done sort of a pilot study, and I say we, I mean Carol and Haley McFarland, and we'll talk a little bit more about that because it's absolutely pertinent to to some of the interpretations that I'm going to be making. So you've seen probably both of these pictures a few times now, and it's, again, this is just giving you some context. I took most of my archaeobotanical samples from Site 2, the habitation terraces. I did take some from Site 1, from the very same locations where Carol took some of her micromorph samples, and that's kind of for verification reasons, just so that we could have some overlap. But Site 2 is primarily my focus because Site 2 has hearth features, and hearth features preserve seeds very beautifully. So that's been my focus. So again, as I just said, this is Site 1. This is the agricultural terraces. This is the section that Carol, these little boxes, those are Carol's micromorph samples, and the stars are my archaeobotanical samples. And I took really large samples, and these samples, in addition to being sampled for archaeobotanically, were also sampled for phytoliths, because that will help us get an idea of what they were growing. Pretty unlikely, and as I've found, because I've gone through a few of these samples, that we are going to find any kind of charred seeds, and if we do, it's going to be very difficult to say that these seeds were being used. They could have been burned by naturally occurring fires. Up the hill on the habitation terraces, this is a beautiful diagram done by Carol of one of our little houses, and the stars again denote locations where I took samples. Primarily, I was most excited, as I said before, about the hearths, but we wanted to get an idea of what other areas within the houses could have had, debris. Fireplaces can actually destroy seeds as well. So there is a good chance, and as I found, there's definitely a presence of charred seeds from around the houses as well. And I even took samples well outside the door in some cases, and then also just on the landing. So yeah. So coming to our results, then I'll begin with the domesticate results from the charred seed sorting. I have sorghum, as I said before. I have pearl millet, and I've got broomtail millet, and those are all the cereals. These are all cereals that we know that people use, and I've seen people selling these in the local markets. Sorghum is not grown, as I said, in Nguruka now, but it is being sold in the area. People import it from other places. It's just kind of interesting that they're not growing it now. Pearl millet, again, very, very common, very popular. Broomtail millet is less common, and there are some wild varieties as well, but this appears to be the domesticated variety. An interesting trend that I've seen so far, and I'm not quite finished with my sorting yet, but the majority of charred cereal grains identified are pearl millet, followed closely behind by sorghum. Now, again, it's kind of early days yet, but the fact that we're finding just as much pearl millet as sorghum kind of supports that argument that there was some kind of intercropping going on. They were probably growing multiple kinds of cereals. And the other domesticates that are coming up are baobab, where I'm about 90% certain it's baobab. The seeds look right for that. And definitely legumes, vigna in particular, possibly some others. I've got a trip to UCL where I'm going to have a look at their excellent reference collection just this next week, and I'm going to see if we can get some more solid identifications. But there's quite a strong relationship, or a very strong tradition of growing legumes along with cereals for a lot of different reasons. It's a very good food source, but also it's good for the soil as well. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later as well. So these are the wild and weedy taxa that have showed up in my samples. Initially, I was not finding charred weed seeds. So I couldn't really make an argument that they were archaeological. But the more I sort, the more I find these charred weed seeds. So there's a lot of different ways that they could be getting charred. One of the most interesting ways that they are, archaeobotanically significant ways that they end up in this record is when they are being harvested. So the weeds grow up with the crops and they're cut off and then, used in the kitchen. and so you'll get these weed seeds coming in. And you've got these relationships between crops and weed taxa that can be used to form arguments about what suite of crops may have been grown. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my interpretation. But for the time being, I primarily have only family identifications, but I am getting some wild cereals and some wild beans as well. So cereals and beans, again, very happy at Nguru. We've also got, this is not a seed, but it's a charred stalk of typha. And typha this is actually a picture from the river that runs the Nguru River, as a matter of fact. And this is typha. And it's the first evidence, potential evidence of thatching material, which is kind of not one of my main questions, but it is interesting because it's some of the first evidence that we've had of thatching material at Nguru. We don't know what was over their heads, so that's kind of exciting. So again, as I said, Carol and Haley McParland did kind of a preliminary phytolith study, looking particularly at the samples that came from that section that Carol sampled for micromorph. And what we found was really interesting. We found sorghum, definitely sorghum up here, the non-articulated, which is great because it means that we're getting it in the kitchen, which if we're getting it in the kitchen, it means they're definitely eating it. But if we're also getting it in the fields, it's a pretty solid argument that they were also growing it. So that's great. Be cool if we can find some pearl millet as well. That's what we'll look for next. But we're also finding these phytoliths that are associated with rice. Grassuliforms, scoop phylobates, double-peaked phytoliths. I'm not a phytolith person, but from what I understand, the main thing that we have to look for, that we need to confirm, is that they're the right size to be domesticated rice rather than wild rice. And I need to start finding evidence of rice in my archaeobotanical samples. So I've got my eyes peeled for that now. But if we do indeed have rice, that would explain why we're getting these paddy-like soils, which is really exciting. Because rice has never been found growing this far inland this early in East Africa. So that would be really, really cool if we can confirm that. So just to summarize the implications, which I've kind of talked about already, sorghum and several other cereals have been found in hearth contexts based primarily on charred seeds. And sorghum, we know, is definitely grown in the fields based on phytoliths. It's unclear whether it was the primary crop, especially since we're finding all of this pearl millet. But sorghum is often favored because there are quite a few drought-resistant varieties. So people like it, but it's looking more and more like they were growing quite a few different things. So the rice phytoliths can be difficult to distinguish, but if we can get some more analysis done, and we're working on developing a larger study, we can kind of tie the size of the phytoliths to environmental criteria, which will help us make an argument for domestication or just wild rice. As I said before, rice is not known to have been cultivated in the past, and the current climate is much too dry. So we'd need enough water to establish these paddy-like soils in order for it to have been grown in the past. But we're trying to get that evidence, so that's exciting. And the phytoliths lists originate from samples taken from the fields comprised of alluvial sediments, the same place that Carol's occurs, and they were irrigated by numerous stone-lined water channels. These features could have been what made our paddy wet, wet enough to support rice. Rice was already a valuable agricultural commodity traded up and down the coast and along the caravan routes. I've done quite a bit of historical research, and no doubt rice was really important, but we have no evidence that it was being used this far inland from historical or archaeological sources. So this would be an exciting bit of news. So talking about the weed assemblage, as I was before, the presence of charred weed seeds, which are associated with specific crops from hearth context, could support specific cropping strategies, as I said before. And I've just come across a really interesting article coming out of Egypt, but looking at an assemblage that's a bit larger than mine, but it's an assemblage that's quite similar. So she's getting quite a lot of cereals, quite a lot of beans, and in particular, quite a lot of clover. And I have some unidentified seeds that I'm hoping to look at and compare with this reference collection in London this next week, and possibly see if we might have some clover, because it's a really interesting, really interesting argument. And there's all kinds of implications for that, especially in terms of soil management, because these three particular plants are really good for the soil, and then also helping to confirm whether or not there was some kind of intercropping going on. And finally, the big picture. So I guess, yeah, the main point is that Engeruka has been perceived as being a failure based on a poor understanding of the agriculture, based on a few sorghum seeds from a study that we don't really understand very well. And despite that, this information has been used to influence policy decisions. And I'm making the argument that we still don't have enough data to really make that argument, and that we need to do quite a bit more work. And so that's kind of the goal of my project. I'm just a small piece, but that's the area project as a whole. So thank you.
So questions for Senna, Colin? Oh no. Other Colin.